Somewhere above 3,000 meters, the wind does not knock. It enters. It pushes through the gaps in the mud walls, through the edges of the felt door cover, through the seams of a house that has stood in the same valley for generations. Outside, the temperature drops past -20. The snow does not fall softly here. It arrives in horizontal waves that bury the lower pastures and seal the mountain passes for weeks at a time. There is no road. There is no market. There is no possibility of resupply until spring decides to return. And inside a low, warm room that smells of wood smoke and fermented dough, a woman is already working. She has been working since before the light came. She will still be working when the light goes. Everything her family eats today and tomorrow and the day after that will come from her hands, from this kitchen, from a system so quietly intelligent that most people looking directly at it would never recognize what they were seeing. This is not a story about poverty. This is not a story about hardship as spectacle. This is a story about one of the most sophisticated food production systems ever built into a domestic space, designed not by engineers or architects, but by generations of mountain women who understood cold, fire, grain, fat, and time in ways that no textbook has fully captured. If you find yourself drawn to stories about overlooked intelligence and forgotten systems of life, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. What happens inside a winter kitchen in the Afghan highlands will change the way you think about bread, about butter, and about what it actually means to feed a family when the world outside has gone completely still. The first thing you need to understand is what this kitchen is actually up against. Winter in the high ranges of Afghanistan, particularly in the central Hazarajat Plateau and the northeastern mountain corridors, is not a season of inconvenience. It is a months-long siege. Villages at high altitude can be cut off from the outside world for 4 to 6 months without interruption. Temperatures that would shut down a modern city become the daily background. Livestock must be kept alive. Fuel must be rationed. Water sources freeze. Children are kept close to the one room in the house that holds heat. And all of this pressure, every single dimension of it, lands in the kitchen. What makes this remarkable is not simply that people survive. Humans have survived in extreme cold across the planet for millennia. What makes it remarkable is the elegance of the solution. The Afghan Highland kitchen during winter is not a place of struggle. It is a place of precision. Every decision made inside it, from the shape of the oven to the temperature of the water used in the dough, from the timing of the butter making to the order in which foods are stored, reflects a body of knowledge so refined that it has its own internal logic, its own seasonal calendar, and its own hierarchy of priorities. Understanding that system requires starting where all of it starts. It requires starting with the dough. Wheat flour is the foundation of life in this landscape, not metaphorically, literally. In communities where fresh vegetables disappear with the first hard frost, where meat is consumed carefully and mostly for special occasions or crisis moments, and where the variety of available calories narrows dramatically as winter deepens, bread becomes the caloric anchor of every meal. A family in a high mountain village might eat bread at every sitting, morning through evening, for months. Not because they lack imagination, but because bread is what the environment allows to be produced consistently, safely, and in sufficient volume when almost everything else is impossible. But here's the thing that most outsiders miss when they imagine this situation. They picture a kind of bare subsistence, a flat, rough thing that keeps people alive without much else going for it. What they are not picturing is the science of what that dough actually is, and why it works the way it does in cold conditions. The dough prepared in these kitchens during winter is almost always leavened with a fermentation starter, a living culture maintained across weeks and months, fed with small amounts of flour and water, kept alive near the warmth of the fire. This is not a modern concept. It is one of the oldest food technologies on Earth. And in a high-altitude winter kitchen, it solves problems that a packet of commercial yeast never could. The fermentation starter is self-sustaining. It requires no purchasing, no refrigeration, no replacement. It is passed between households, sometimes between generations, sometimes across entire valleys. Women who share the same strain of starter are, in a real sense, using a technology with a lineage measured not in years, but in decades. The fermentation process also changes the nutritional profile of the flour. Phytic acid, which is present in wheat and which can block the absorption of minerals like iron and zinc, is broken down during a slow fermentation. In a diet that is already nutritionally constrained by the season, this matters enormously. The bread is not just filling. It is, by design, more nutritious than a faster-made version of itself would be. That is not an accident. It is the accumulated result of a culture learning, over centuries, how to extract maximum value from the one resource it reliably had. The dough itself is worked by hand, and the physical act of kneading is not simply about texture. The pressure and folding of the dough develops the gluten structure that allows the bread to hold its shape and rise evenly on the heat source. In cold ambient temperatures, this matters because the dough rises more slowly. The woman working it knows this without thinking about it. She adjusts. She keeps the dough closer to the fire than she might in warmer weather. She wraps it in cloth. She reads the texture with her fingers and understands from the elasticity alone whether the fermentation has done what it needs to do. This is not guesswork. It is calibrated knowledge expressed through touch. Now, consider the oven. Because the oven in a Highland Afghan kitchen is not what you are imagining, and once you understand what it actually is, the entire cooking system starts to reveal itself. The tandoor is a cylindrical clay oven, set into or near the floor, heated from below by a fire of dried dung, wood, or a combination of both. In winter, when fuel is one of the most precious and carefully managed resources in the household, the tandoor is not left running all day. It is fired at specific moments, allowed to reach a particular temperature, and then used with a discipline that minimizes fuel consumption without sacrificing the quality of the food. The interior walls of the tandoor absorb the heat and radiate it back, which means that once the oven reaches temperature, the bread baked on its inner walls cooks quickly, efficiently, and with a characteristic texture that no flat pan or open flame can replicate. The bread is slapped directly onto the interior wall of the tandoor. This requires a technique that is entirely physical, a practiced motion that spreads the dough evenly, presses it against the hot clay without tearing it, and releases it cleanly so it does not fall into the base of the fire. The first time a young woman does this, she burns herself. She does it wrong. The bread falls, or tears, or comes off the wall before it is ready. But the learning is fast, because it has to be. This is not a recreational skill, it is a survival skill, and it is taught by watching, by doing, and by failing in the presence of someone who knows exactly how it is supposed to feel. The bread that emerges from this process is called naan in the Dari-speaking parts of the Highlands, though the regional variations in shape, thickness, and crust character are significant enough that the word barely covers the full range. Some loaves are long and oval, scored with parallel cuts that allow the interior to cook evenly while the surface blisters in the heat. Others are thick and round, designed to hold warmth longer, to stay soft under wrapping, to function as both food and eating vessel when soup or stew is involved. The choice of shape is not aesthetic. It is functional. Thicker bread retains heat longer, which matters when the family is eating in a room where the temperature hovers near freezing. Thinner bread cooks faster, which matters when the fuel supply is being managed carefully. If you are starting to sense that every single element of this kitchen system was designed to solve more than one problem at the same time, you are beginning to understand what makes it extraordinary. And the next element, the one that most people overlook entirely, makes the bread system look simple by comparison. Butter in a high-mountain Afghan winter kitchen is not a condiment. It is a caloric and cultural technology with a logic entirely its own. And understanding where it comes from, how it is made, and how it is stored and used tells you something profound about how these communities understood nutrition before the word nutrition existed in any language they spoke. The butter begins in summer. In the warm months, when the high pastures are accessible and the animals are grazing on the mountain grass, women milk the cows, the goats, and above all the fat-tailed sheep and the yak crosses that thrive at altitude. The milk is rich, higher in fat content than the milk of lowland breeds, partly because of genetics, and partly because of the quality of the alpine grasses these animals eat. This milk is processed into butter through a method that has not changed in its fundamentals for thousands of years. The milk is poured into a skin bag or a wooden churn, and the agitation, repeated rhythmically and for a long time, causes the fat globules to cluster and separate from the liquid. The resulting butter is then clarified, which means it is gently heated until the water evaporates and the milk solids separate and can be removed. What remains is a pure, shelf-stable fat that does not require refrigeration, does not spoil easily in cold storage, and contains a concentration of calories that is almost unmatched by any other food the household produces. This clarified butter, called rogan in Dari, is one of the most important strategic reserves in the entire winter food system. It is stored in sealed containers, often ceramic or wooden, kept in the coolest part of the storage room where the temperature is cold enough to keep the fat solid, but not so cold that it freezes hard and becomes difficult to use. The quantity stored before winter is not arbitrary. It is calculated against the number of people in the household, the expected length of the winter, and the caloric demands of the hardest months. Too little rogan and the family faces not just hunger, but a specific kind of cold weather vulnerability, because fat is what the body burns to generate heat when temperatures fall below what clothing alone can manage. Too much stored butter and other resources may have been under-prioritized. The calculation is made every single year, adjusted based on the size of the summer herd, the quality of the grazing season, and the condition of the animals before they are brought down from the high pastures. What is fascinating is how rogan is then deployed inside the winter kitchen. It appears in bread dough, where it changes the texture and caloric density of the loaf. It is melted over bread at the table, where it adds warmth in a literal thermal sense, the hot fat slowing the cooling of the bread in a cold room. It is used as the cooking medium for whatever meat, vegetable, or grain dish accompanies the bread. It is stirred into tea, a practice that shocks many visitors, but which makes complete metabolic sense in a context where the human body needs consistent access to fat to maintain core temperature across a long, cold day. And it is used in the preparation of a fermented and dried dairy product that adds protein and tangy flavor to the diet during the deep months when fresh dairy is impossible. This layered deployment means that rogan is not a single ingredient. It is a system within a system, a form of stored solar energy, since the summer grass that produced the milk that became the butter was itself grown by sunlight, now sealed in a jar, and waiting for the darkest months to release its value. The women who managed this system were not thinking in those terms, but the logic they practiced was exactly that. Subscribe if you are realizing that what looked like a simple mountain kitchen is actually a layered engineering system built across the entire year. The people inside it were solving thermodynamics, nutrition, fermentation chemistry, and fuel management simultaneously. And they were doing it in a room the size of a modest living room with no instruments except their senses and their memory. The water question in a winter Highland kitchen deserves its own examination because it is the problem that shapes everything else in ways that are not immediately obvious. When the primary water source, whether a spring-fed channel, a small stream, or a communal well, freezes or becomes difficult to access, the kitchen does not simply scale back its operations. It adapts. Snow is collected and melted. Ice is broken from surfaces and brought inside. The fuel cost of heating water becomes a real calculation that intersects with every other fire-related decision in the household. A single pot of boiling water that serves three purposes simultaneously, cooking, cleaning, and warmth, represents a more efficient use of fuel than three separate smaller operations. This is obvious in retrospect, but in practice, organizing the kitchen day around that logic requires a sequence of decisions that must be made every single morning, in the dark, before the household wakes. The fire itself is the heart of this coordination. In a traditional Highland Afghan home, the main heat source and the cooking fire are often the same fire, or closely related fires sharing the same fuel supply. This means that cooking is not a separate activity from heating. It is continuous with it. The smoke management, the airflow, the timing of when to add fuel and when to let the fire settle, all of these decisions carry double consequence. They affect the flavor and texture of the food and the temperature of the room in which the family is living. A woman managing this fire through a winter day is performing a kind of continuous thermal engineering, constantly reading the needs of the food against the needs of the people, adjusting without instruments, guided entirely by experience and observation. There is a specific moment in the bread-making sequence that captures this beautifully. Before the tandoor is fired for the main baking, the larger cooking fire has often already been used to heat water, to warm the previous day's leftover bread wrapped near the coals, and to prepare the morning tea. The fuel used for these early tasks is calculated not to exhaust the supply before the tandoor needs its heat. The dough, already fermented overnight near the warmth of the dying fire, is shaped while the tandoor heats. The shaping itself generates warmth in the dough from the friction of the hands, which helps the final rise before the bread hits the wall. The sequence is not accidental. It is choreographed, and it has been choreographed the same way, in the same order, for reasons that are thermal, biological, and practical all at once. The storage architecture that surrounds this kitchen is another dimension of the system that rarely receives proper attention. In a high mountain village sealed by snow, the storage room is as important as the kitchen itself. Grain, dried legumes, dried fruits, clarified butter, fermented dairy, dried herbs, and preserved meat are arranged not arbitrarily, but according to a logic of access and preservation. The things most needed most often are closest to the door, closest to the kitchen threshold, where they can be retrieved without fully opening the storage space to the cold. The things that need the coldest temperature for long-term preservation, primarily the fat and the meat, are stored in the section most exposed to the exterior cold, which is not a flaw in the architecture, but a deliberate use of it. This means the cold is not the enemy of the storage system. The cold is the refrigerator. The deep freeze outside is not something to be overcome. It is a resource to be managed. There is a profound difference between those two orientations, and it is visible in every design decision these houses contain. Deep in the winter months, when the stored provisions are being drawn down and the spring remains months away, the kitchen must perform a kind of rationing intelligence that adds yet another layer to its complexity. The mother of the household, and in most of these communities it is the mother who holds the primary role in kitchen management, knows how much grain remains. She knows how many people must eat from it, and for how many more weeks. She adjusts. She extends the bread by incorporating a small proportion of dried and ground legumes into the dough, which changes the texture but adds protein. She uses more rogan to increase the caloric value of smaller portions. She prepares soups and stews that make grain and fat stretch further by combining them with water and dried vegetables into broths that are nutritionally complete even in modest volume. None of this is performed with scales or measurement tools. It is performed with memory, with pattern recognition, and with a knowledge of each family member's body, and needs so intimate that it cannot be separated from love. She knows which child needs more fat in the cold. She knows which elder needs softer bread, because the teeth are no longer what they were. She knows when the stored meat should be introduced not for nutrition alone, but because morale, the invisible thermal factor of human happiness, matters too in a house sealed by winter for months. The bread that comes out of this kitchen carries all of that. It is the visible result of 100 invisible decisions. When it comes off the tandoor wall, blistered and warm, with the slight tang of the fermentation and the deep, toasty smell of the clay, it is not just food. It is the output of a management system that has been running continuously since before the first snow fell. It is the proof that the system is holding, that the calculations were right, that the family will make it through. And there is something else this bread does that no nutrition chart records. When it is shared, it performs a social function that is inseparable from its physical one. In a household sealed from the world, where the same people see each other every single day in the same small rooms, the act of making bread and placing it at the center of the meal is a daily act of reaffirmation. It says, "We are still here. The fire is still burning." The hands that know how to do this are still working. We are going to be fine. The mountain bread of the Afghan highlands, made from fermented dough, baked on the inner wall of a clay oven, eaten with clarified butter stored since summer, is not primitive food. It is a precision instrument. It solves cold, it solves caloric density, it solves morale, it solves fuel efficiency, and it solves the social architecture of a closed household in a single daily act of production. The woman who makes it is not simply a cook. She is the operational core of a survival system of remarkable sophistication. What we call tradition, in places like this, is often something else entirely. It is engineering that has survived because it worked. It is knowledge that was never written down because the people who held it did not need to write it down. It lived in the hands, in the sequence of morning tasks, in the smell of the dough at a particular hour, in the sound of the butter when it is right. This is knowledge that took centuries to build, and it runs every single day, invisibly, in rooms that most of the world will never see. Think about what this kitchen actually represented. No electricity, no thermostat, no grocery store within weeks of travel. And yet the caloric needs of an entire family were met. The warmth of the household was managed, the nutritional vulnerabilities of deep winter were countered, and the morale of a sealed community was sustained. All of it from a clay oven, a jar of butter, a living culture of fermented dough, and the knowledge of one woman who knew how all the pieces fit together. The next time you bake bread, or spread butter, or let dough rise on a warm counter, you are participating in the same chain of understanding. You are doing, in a modern kitchen with every convenience, what someone in a sealed highland valley does by necessity, by memory, and by an intelligence that deserves far more recognition than the world has ever given it. If this story revealed something you did not expect, leave a comment below. Tell us which traditional food system, remote community, survival kitchen, or forgotten way of life you want to see explored next. There is a world of invisible intelligence out there, and this channel exists to find it and bring it to you. Subscribe so you do not miss what we uncover next.